I remember the day my father and I first visited the Fair Meadows Estates development. The sun was caught in the cottonwood trees that lined the winding road, casting shimmering patterns of light across the manicured lawns. It felt peaceful, almost too peaceful for an ordinary retirement neighborhood. We stepped into the model home with its open-plan kitchen and pristine carpets, and a friendly sales agent assured us that Fair Meadows was unlike any other community around. "We have monthly pancake breakfasts and an active gardening club," the agent boasted, wearing a grin that displayed an almost unnerving certainty in this place. "We want everyone to feel secure here. We've gone above and beyond to offer 24-hour private security and defibrillators installed throughout in case of emergencies. You'll never have to worry about your health here." The mention of defibrillators was what sealed the deal for my father. His heart issues, though stabilized, had been plaguing him for the past few years. He'd survived one mild heart attack already, and doctors warned him to remain vigilant. While we hoped it would never come to it, I can't pretend it didn't feel reassuring to know help was supposedly just a few steps away. Fair Meadows Estates had a homeowners association, an HOA with its own rules, regulations, and budgets. My father was just relieved that part of our monthly fees would fund amenities that included emergency medical equipment. Little did we know how drastically the situation would change once the HOA board turned over leadership and decided saving money trumped human life. From the outset, I noticed how the HOA board managed its responsibilities. There were quarterly meetings in the community center where residents sat politely in folding chairs, sipping coffee from paper cups. It was always an orderly affair. New gardening schedules, improvements to the communal pool, and updates on landscaping budgets were passed around on neatly printed agendas. The tone was calm and quietly businesslike, so different from the chaos you might expect in some more raucous neighborhoods. At first, I didn't pay much attention to the smaller line items in the budget reports. My father and I typically only attended meetings if something pressing was on the docket, like a proposed rule about driveway fences or a discussion about renovating the tennis courts. Most folks there were in their late 50s or 60s, newly retired with a penchant for group discussions and the occasional spat about property lines. My father, though older than many, was healthy enough to indulge in the calmer side of life. He liked playing bocce ball on the communal lawn with a handful of neighbors who shared his love of leisurely competition. One particular neighbor, Leonard, was always cautious about the future. "You never know," he would say. "We're not getting any younger. Having those defibrillators is a good idea. Makes me sleep better knowing they're around." Leonard's words were a comfort each time I found myself flicking through the glossy community handbook. It boasted about state-of-the-art safety features. The defibrillator station's bright red metal cabinets were placed like silent sentries near the clubhouse, the gym, and every other building people frequented. There was even one installed by the tennis courts, in case a match got a bit too strenuous for an aging resident. Yet, behind the scenes, the HOA's new board was wrestling with the cost of maintaining these machines. As I would discover later, they had brokered a maintenance agreement with a local healthcare provider to keep the devices properly checked and functional. But as that contract neared its renewal date, the board's newly elected president, a woman named Regina, who prided herself on savvy budgeting, questioned whether so many defibrillators were truly necessary. "The cost is astronomical," Regina said to the board during an open meeting. "If a resident is in trouble, we call 911. No need to keep all these expensive machines that basically do the same thing paramedics are trained for." A small cluster of neighbors nodded in agreement, especially those who never used the gym or had no experience with major health risks. They seemed happy to shave a few dollars off monthly dues. Others, like Leonard and my father, would occasionally raise concerns. What if paramedics get delayed? Or isn't it better to have immediate intervention? But they were brushed aside with the promise that the board would do a full cost-benefit analysis. In the months that followed, some defibrillators were quietly removed. No official announcement was made. It was simply a temporary measure to evaluate which stations were utilized most. Whenever a few of us inquired about this, we were met with a standard, practiced reply: "We're handling it. No reason to worry." By the time the final budget was voted on at the year's end, Most defibrillators were either gone or locked away, labeled as unnecessary. Unnecessary. That's the word I'll never forget. My father read it in the minutes from the meeting he missed. He'd been under the weather that week, feeling a shortness of breath that came and went. He shook his head at the notice, closed the HOA's newsletter, and tried to focus on something uplifting like the next community social event. We never thought we'd end up needing those machines so soon. And, in a cruel twist, when the moment arrived and my father's heart truly faltered, there would be nothing there to save him. No defibrillator on the wall, no quick fix. Instead, just a frantic scramble that would change my father's life, and mine, forever. It wasn't exactly surprising that my father's health began to show more warning signs around that time. Stress can take a real toll, and while he'd never admit it to me, I knew he was perturbed by the HOA's decisions. He brought his concerns to multiple board members only to be politely, and sometimes not so politely, dismissed. He'd say, "It's just a matter of time before someone pays the price for this." But whenever he tried discussing it in more depth, there was this intangible pressure not to make waves. Many residents simply didn't want to dwell on unpleasant possibilities. After all, this was supposed to be their idyllic retirement sanctuary, and no one wanted to think about medical emergencies. One chilly autumn morning, I found my father sitting on the bench outside the community clubhouse, looking more frail than usual. His sweater drooped from his shoulders, and his eyes seemed distant. "I'm fine," he insisted when I asked if anything hurt. "Just a little short of breath, that's all." A few days later, his breathlessness intensified. I drove him to his cardiologist, who urged him to take it easy and avoid exerting himself too much. "Have you considered moving somewhere with more comprehensive care options?" the doctor asked. My father frowned. He liked Fair Meadows despite the HOA drama. He had friends here, a daily routine, and a sense of independence he feared he'd lose in a more specialized senior facility. So we decided to stay put, but I made a mental note never to let him be alone during strenuous activities. If he wanted to go for a stroll around the neighborhood, I was there by his side. If he wanted to pop into the clubhouse for a coffee social, I made sure to drive him in our golf cart. All the while, I kept telling myself the paramedics were only a phone call away if things took a turn for the worse. It was around this time that I noticed how seldom the topic of safety came up in HOA board communications. The monthly newsletter was packed with announcements about upcoming events, like a harvest luncheon or holiday lights contest. But there was never an update on the whereabouts or the status of the defibrillators that once dotted the community. Some of us tried to bring it up in conversation, but it felt like the board actively steered discussions elsewhere. There was one board member, Thomas, who expressed he wasn't entirely comfortable with the new direction. He quietly admitted that he hadn't voted in favor of removing the machines. But the majority carried the motion, he whispered to me in the library corner of the clubhouse, where we pretended to be checking out community books. Regina convinced everyone that 911 is enough. I don't feel good about it, but I'm only one voice. With a frustrated sigh, I thanked him for at least being honest. I wish the rest of the community knew how close the vote was, I told him. But the board controlled the official messaging, and each time the defibrillator question arose, they stifled it with a rehearsed set of bullet points. Cost savings, paramedic response times, insurance disclaimers. Still, life moved on. Residents chatted about their grandkids and organized potlucks. Even my father, as apprehensive as he was, tried to live each day with a measure of normalcy. He'd sit in the courtyard with Leonard, sharing stories about their younger days. Leonard had been a traveling salesman, my father an accountant in a bustling corporate environment. They'd reminisce about simpler times, joking that they used to worry about taxes and mortgage rates, and now they worried about medical bills and missing defibrillators. Then came the day it all culminated, a crisp morning that glowed gold through the autumn leaves. My father woke up with a hint of dizziness, but brushed it aside. "Just going to stretch my legs," he said. I didn't argue because he seemed relatively steady. I figured he'd walk slowly around the block. I regret letting him go alone, but you can't keep watch 24 hours a day. He was determined to maintain some autonomy, and I didn't want to smother him. So I watched him shuffle down the front walkway, leaning on his cane. It was one of those moments you look back on and curse yourself for not insisting, "Wait, let me come too." But by then, the day had already begun. A neighbor's doorbell camera would later provide a grainy video capturing part of the incident. My father was walking near the clubhouse when he suddenly clutched his chest and sank to his knees, his cane clattering on the sidewalk. There was no immediate crowd around him, just a few folks walking dogs or heading to the mailbox. Within seconds, word spread that someone was in trouble. A call to 911 was made. Some residents hurried to help. One woman gently lowered him onto his back, while another frantically shouted for assistance. Someone yelled for the defibrillator, expecting it to be mounted on the side of the clubhouse, where it used to be. But the red metal cabinet was gone. A leftover space on the wall bore only faint screw holes and a discolored patch. People scrambled in confusion, some running to check if there was another defibrillator in the pool area or the gym. But the gym was locked that early in the morning, and the pool station had been removed months ago. Everywhere they looked, the machines were absent. In those critical seconds, my father's heart was in turmoil. One neighbor started CPR, another hovered nearby with a phone, describing the scene to the emergency operator. The minutes stretched out in excruciating fashion, the kind of waiting you can't ever forget once you've experienced it. And I had just stepped out of the shower when my phone buzzed with a friend's frantic voice. "Hurry, your dad, he's collapsed." I hardly took a breath as I stumbled over my shoes, racing toward the front door. Little did I know that by the time I reached him, the ambulance would still be minutes away. In those spare, terrifying moments, every decision and every cost-cutting measure the HOA had made suddenly came crashing down in a single brutal instant. I arrived at the clubhouse in a panicked haze. The morning sun felt unnaturally bright, glaring off the windows and burning into my eyes as I raced across the parking lot. A small knot of neighbors stood over my father, their faces etched with shock and worry. "Where's the defibrillator?" I called out, half breathless, but I could see the empty bracket on the wall, no device in sight. My throat went dry. "He stopped breathing," a woman cried, tears welling up in her eyes. Another man pressed down on my father's chest in rhythmic pumps. He'd been trained in CPR decades ago, but he admitted between compressions that his recall was spotty at best. Everything seemed disjointed. Sounds came in muffled bursts, my heart hammered, and I could barely think straight as I lowered myself beside Dad. I took over the chest compressions, trying to recall the correct pace, the angle of my hands, the pressure needed. Each push felt like a desperate plea to keep him with us. Someone else was on the phone, yelling at a 911 operator about my father's condition. "He's not breathing. He's unresponsive. Where are you? Where's the ambulance?" Sirens wailed in the distance, but the minutes dragged on like hours. I could sense the dread thickening in the air. Had the defibrillator been there, we might have had a fighting chance to shock his heart back into rhythm. Instead, all we could do was CPR, hoping to maintain blood flow until paramedics arrived. Nobody could say it out loud, but the unspoken truth was glaring. The HOA's cost-cutting decision might just claim a life. When the ambulance finally screeched into the parking lot, I nearly collapsed from relief. The paramedics rushed out, AED in hand, carefully taking over the resuscitation efforts. They tore open my father's shirt, attached the pads to his chest, and commanded everyone to stand back as the machine analyzed his heart's electrical activity. I shut my eyes, trying to steady myself. When the defibrillator's robotic voice commanded a shock, I felt a jolt of hope. The paramedics delivered multiple shocks, and it felt as if time stood still. I remember thinking about all the times my father had gently teased me for worrying about him too much. How he used to wave away my concerns with a gentle laugh, saying, "Hey, I'm tougher than I look." After what felt like an eternity, the paramedics managed to get a weak pulse. They loaded my father onto a stretcher and whisked him into the ambulance. In the swirl of uniformed figures and flashing lights, I clung to my father's hand for a moment and whispered, "Hang on, Dad. Just hang on." Then, in a blur of sirens, the ambulance roared away, leaving the cluster of neighbors standing silent and stunned. Someone touched my shoulder, offering a shaky word of reassurance. Another person exhaled a broken sob. Everyone understood what had happened. The one piece of equipment that could have saved precious minutes, those defibrillators, had been removed. I spent the rest of that day at the hospital, pacing in a sterile waiting room under humming fluorescent lights. Doctors and nurses rushed in and out, occasionally giving me updates. "He's in critical condition. We're doing everything we can. Please be patient." The fear gnawed at me. A lump lodged in my throat that refused to go away. Eventually, a cardiologist approached, wearing an expression that was both compassionate and weary. "Your father survived the initial crisis, but his heart underwent severe strain. The next 48 hours are going to be crucial." My breath caught. Relief and anxiety battled inside me. I held on to hope that he'd pull through. He was a resilient man who had overcome challenges before. But the question weighed heavily. Had the delay in administering a life-saving shock caused irreversible damage? Meanwhile, word spread through Fair Meadows. My phone lit up with messages from neighbors, each note tinged with horror and sympathy. Leonard called me in tears, ranting about the unfairness of the situation. "They took away our safety, and now look what's happened," he cried. Others were furious. Some demanded an emergency HOA meeting, outraged that the defibrillators were gone, outraged that a neighbor they respected and admired had nearly died. "This is on them," people whispered, pointing fingers at Regina and her board members. I got calls from the local press, too. It appeared that one resident had alerted a small community news outlet about what had happened. When a reporter asked if I was willing to comment, I hesitated. I was so focused on my father's survival that I didn't want to get dragged into public disputes. But the anger inside me was real. The pain in my chest, this heartbreak, was more than I could contain. In that moment, I resolved that no one else in Fair Meadows would endure such terror without recourse. If my father pulled through, or even if the worst happened, I wouldn't let the story fade. The world needed to know that defibrillators had been quietly stripped away under the guise of budget concerns. The people responsible for that short-sighted decision had to face accountability. At the hospital, day turned to night, and I stayed by my father's bedside, listening to the rhythmic beeping of machines that kept a fragile hold on his life. I recalled how proud he'd been the day he moved into Fair Meadows, how he'd marveled at the modern amenities, the sense of security. Now, all I could do was pray that he'd recover enough to share his voice in the fight that was about to begin. The quiet hours in the hospital waiting room gave me time to reflect. I remembered small, seemingly inconsequential details about Fair Meadows. Potluck gatherings, the clack of mahjong tiles in the library, the laughter at holiday parties. People moved there for a relaxed, secure life. Many were retirees, couples who wanted to enjoy their golden years without fear. Now, I watched them walk into my father's hospital room with trembling hands and tearful eyes. They brought homemade soup or crochet blankets, but mostly they brought stories and regrets. "I can't believe the defibrillators are gone," they'd say, voice shaky, as if still trying to grasp the reality. "How could they do that to us?" Thomas, the board member who had initially opposed the removals, visited one afternoon. I told him it was risky, he murmured, eyes full of sorrow. Regina and her allies insisted it was too expensive. They claimed the liability was too high, that we didn't have the manpower to maintain them, that paramedics could always handle emergencies in time. He let out a shaky sigh. I wish I had fought harder. My father, sedated and hooked to various tubes, remained unconscious, trapped in a precarious limbo. The doctor said the next few days would tell us more. So I navigated a flood of emotions, guilt, anger, and, somewhere deep inside, hope. I was not alone. Other residents felt betrayed and fearful, worried they might be next in line if tragedy struck. Meanwhile, the local news began to circle like hawks. They smelled a scandal in the making, and they wanted a statement. So, I reluctantly scheduled an on-camera interview with a reporter from the local TV station. We stood in front of the hospital, where the wind rustled the clipped hedges near the entrance. I tried to steady my trembling hands by clasping them in front of me. When the cameras rolled, the reporter asked, "Can you share with our viewers what happened?" I spoke of my father's heart condition, The sudden collapse, the frantic search for a defibrillator that no longer existed on the wall. "We lost precious minutes," I said, trying to keep my composure. "He could have died. He still might not fully recover." She pressed further. "Why were the defibrillators removed?" I took a breath, recalling the many nights I'd lain awake, stewing over that exact question. The HOA decided it was too expensive to maintain them. They valued cutting costs over saving lives. The interview went live that evening. A storm of controversy followed. Some fair-minded board members offered their condolences and quietly expressed regret. But Regina and her close circle dug in their heels. They issued a brief statement that read like it was drafted by a legal team. "We extend our deepest sympathies to the family and pray for a speedy recovery. The decision to remove certain defibrillators was made after evaluating use and maintenance expenses. Fair Meadows Estates is committed to the health and safety of all residents, and we will review this incident to see if any changes to our current policies are warranted." Changes. Warranted. The wording felt deliberately lukewarm, lacking accountability. It ignited a fury among the neighbors. Within days, a special HOA meeting was called by popular demand, an emergency session open to all to address community concerns. It took place in the clubhouse, in the very spot where my father collapsed. Chairs were set in rows, and the room was buzzing with tension. I arrived with Leonard and Thomas, all of us hoping for some kind of justice. Dad was still in the hospital, obviously, but the fight had to continue. People whispered anxiously, waiting for the board members to arrive. When Regina finally showed up, accompanied by her usual allies, it was as though a chill crept into the room. She sat behind a folding table at the front, adjusting the microphone with the stiff posture of someone determined to control the narrative. The overhead lights flickered slightly, heightening the unsettled atmosphere. A hush fell. Regina cleared her throat. "We understand there has been a terrible incident involving one of our residents. Let's start by saying we're all praying for his recovery." I stood up, anger sparking. "He's not just one of our residents. He's my father. A father who very well might have died because you decided to remove the very device that could have saved him." Gasps rippled through the audience. Regina tried to maintain a semblance of poise. "We had to make a budgetary decision that benefited the community as a whole," she said, eyes darting around the room. "We're not medical professionals. We have to rely on cost analyses and the advice of legal counsel." A flurry of voices rose in protest. Leonard stepped forward, voice quavering with emotion, but fierce in its resolve. "You can talk about cost all you want, but some things are priceless, like human lives." Applause erupted from the rows of seated residents. Others chimed in, accusing the board of penny pinching, ignoring the real risks. Regina tried to maintain order by tapping the microphone, but no one was in the mood to be silenced. Finally, Thomas stood up. He reminded everyone of how close the board's vote had been and how he'd been overruled. Then he turned to Regina. "Look what it's done to our community. People are scared, angry, and rightfully so. The next time a crisis happens, we can't just pray an ambulance arrives on time." Regina's face reddened. She stammered about due process and needing more concrete data, but the crowd was having none of it. They demanded that the defibrillators be reinstated immediately and that an apology be issued. Amid the clamor, someone suggested a recall vote, an attempt to remove the current board from power. Shouts of agreement swelled. Regina's eyes flashed with panic. She tried to gather her papers, presumably to call for recess. But the floodgates had opened. People were fed up, and no practice statements or half apologies would quiet them. I stood there, letting a swell of relief wash over me. Maybe justice could be served if the community pulled together. Maybe my father's suffering wouldn't be in vain. In the aftermath of that stormy meeting, Fair Meadows was abuzz with calls for change. People who never cared much for HOA politics suddenly showed up, demanding to participate in the upcoming recall vote. A sense of solidarity emerged. Neighbors looked out for one another, forming committees to gather signatures and campaigning in front yards once dedicated to lawn ornaments and holiday decor. All the while, my father lay in a hospital bed, slowly mending. The cardiologist's updates were cautiously optimistic. He'd suffered damage to his heart muscle, and it might limit some of his mobility in the future, but with the right rehabilitation, there was hope he could return to a semblance of normal life. Each time I visited, I read him the latest developments. I told him how the community was rallying, how everyone was furious with the board, how they were vowing never again to let such cost-driven negligence prevail. I'd see the spark in his eyes grow stronger each day, as if the prospect of justice and renewed safety was fueling his own determination to heal. Meanwhile, Regina did everything she could to control the fallout. She circulated flyers stating the board's position, that defibrillator maintenance was unsustainable and that the paramedic response times had historically been adequate. But her arguments rang hollow, especially with the fresh memory of my father's collapse. Adequate was hardly the word people wanted to hear. The recall vote was held on a brisk November evening in the same clubhouse. This time, an unprecedented number of residents showed up. No matter the age or health issues, people came out in droves, some in wheelchairs, some leaning on canes, all ready to cast their ballots and make their voices heard. I helped pass out the small paper slips where people wrote their votes. Under the watchful eye of a volunteer oversight committee, residents dropped their votes into a sealed box. An air of anticipation gripped us all as we waited for the counting to begin. I glanced at Thomas, who gave me a reassuring nod. When the results were announced, the atmosphere was electric. Regina and her main allies were recalled by a staggering majority. In their place, a group of new board members was voted in, people who had promised full transparency, a commitment to safety, and the reinstatement of defibrillators throughout the community. Shouts of joy and relief echoed in the high ceilings of the clubhouse. It felt like a redemption, a chance to put things right. That very night, the new board took emergency action. They authorized immediate negotiations with a reputable medical supply company to lease and maintain defibrillators at multiple locations around Fair Meadows. Before the meeting concluded, they signed a short-term contract to get units reinstalled as quickly as possible, pending a more thorough long-term solution. Word spread like wildfire, and the next morning, as I accompanied my father's wheelchair along the hospital corridor, I told him the good news. He blinked back tears, a mixture of relief and pride shining in his eyes. He couldn't speak too much. His throat was still sore from the intubation, but he managed to whisper, "We did it." I smiled, placing a hand over his. "You held on," I said softly, "and this place will be safer because of you." 3 weeks later, my father was discharged. We drove home through the autumn-kissed streets, leaves piling in gutters, the air crisp with the promise of winter. As we entered the Fair Meadows main gate, I felt a wave of conflicting emotions. This was the site of so much pain, yet also a place where people had come together to demand better. The new defibrillators hadn't arrived yet, but they were on order, the contract with a medical supply company already signed. A few volunteers, including Leonard, were preparing educational sessions on CPR and defibrillator usage, determined to ensure no one else was caught off guard the way we had been. For my father, returning home was a bittersweet triumph. Neighbors greeted us with hugs, applause, and relieved smiles. Someone had hung a "Welcome Home" banner on a mailbox. The sense of community felt genuine, no longer just superficial niceties. In the following days, we settled into a new routine. We had frequent nurse visits, and Dad spent time in a recliner by the window, reading the local paper or watching squirrels dart across the lawn. But he was never far from the phone. He kept it within arm's reach, determined to stay informed about the reinstallation progress. True to their word, the new board acted fast. Within a month, bright red defibrillator cabinets were mounted in the clubhouse, near the pool, the gym, and even at a few of the more remote corners of the community. Each device was accompanied by signage and instructions, plus a poster listing the names of trained volunteers. Leonard was among them, and so was I. We made sure the entire neighborhood knew how to operate those machines. Though the entire ordeal had left scars, physical and emotional, it also sparked a transformation in Fair Meadows. People talked about safety openly, Budgets were discussed in detail at board meetings, and the reinstalled defibrillators symbolized the shared responsibility residents were now willing to bear. On a brisk morning, not unlike the one when Dad first collapsed, I found myself walking him slowly around the loop near the clubhouse. He leaned on his cane, determinedly placing one foot in front of the other, breathing carefully. Despite the crisp air, a hint of warmth radiated from the sunlight. We paused near the shiny new defibrillator cabinet, installed right where the old one used to be. A wave of emotion welled up inside me. This could have made all the difference, Dad murmured, gazing at the device. I nodded, swallowing hard. But we fought back, and maybe now it will make the difference for someone else. He placed a hand on my shoulder, and for a quiet moment, we just stood there, letting that truth settle. The father I almost lost was alive and standing beside me, in a community that had rediscovered its conscience. No matter how painful the journey, it felt as though we'd finally come full circle, back to the sense of security that had originally drawn him here. But this time, the security was real, grounded in action rather than empty promises. We continued our stroll, accompanied by the soft crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, knowing that together, we had defied apathy and fear. And for my father, that knowledge had become its own kind of healing.